You know, it's that dreaded question that's so deceptively innocent, right? What's your favorite book? It's something you ask sort of as an icebreaker to people, and you're not really considering the kind of existential loophole that you're sending them to. I mean, my favorite books, I have to make a list out of the books that are going to define me as a person, are going to define me as a character, are going to be out there for the world to judge my own taste, my own moral compass, my own ability to appreciate fine works of art but still stay true to my character. I mean, how could I possibly even make a list like that? Well, I made it. This video was requested by Ivan Dean. I'm gonna put his comment, boom, right here. And Ivan Dean, again, thank you so much for your continued support and engagement with this channel. You have commented on here multiple times, and it's always a delight reading the new things that you have to say. So he asked, can I make a video about the top 10 or 15 favorite books of all time, not tethered to any specific genre, just my absolute favorite books, no matter what genre, what kind, what authors. And I said, sure, I can do that. And little did I know how difficult of a question it was. Indeed, so difficult that it has taken me days and days just to put together some kind of list. So what I decided was, I was going to work my way up, because there is one book that I have always said is my absolute favorite. And then from there, I'm going to pick titles that have, sort of come up in conversation now and then whenever I'm thinking of what my most absolute favorite books are, and just kind of went with my gut feeling. Whatever came to mind first, I was like, okay, I'm going to pick that because it's coming into my mind for a reason. It's a sign from God, whatever. So these are, I made 10 originally, and then I thought, you know what? There's still more that I want to talk about. So I made it a top 15. And then there were still more that I wanted to include. And I thought, no, that's enough. This video is going to be longer than a fucking Discovery Channel documentary, and nobody needs to hear me talk for that long. So these are going to be top 15, and I did have some limitations on this list. First and foremost, I saw myself forced to exclude short story collections. And indeed, this was actually very difficult for me, because as I soon came to find, a lot of the books that I actually considered some of my favorites were just comprised of short stories. And I thought, so I said, I'm going to stick with novels, novellas. There are some memoirs, autobiographies, whatever you would want to categorize those as. And there's also even book-length essays that I'm going to be including, because they were just like, I cannot leave this out of my list. You just can't do that to me. So another exception, when comparing this to my other videos, I have always said in my videos that my books are in no particular order whenever I do top lists, because I always say I don't really have a measurement to quantify this book is more disturbing than this, or this is weirder than this is sadder than this. But for this one, since we're talking about my own picks for my own favorite books, my own opinions, I'm going to give myself the chance to be as absolutely subjective, unabashedly selective as possible. So this is going to run from least favorite. Well, I wouldn't call it least favorite, right? Because they're all my favorites. They're all in this list for a reason. But it's more like, let's say it'll be going in increasing levels of favoriteness, right? Yes, without further ado, here are my top 15 favorite books of all time. This is amazing. Cue the trumpets. Never before done on this channel. It's gonna be a little harrowing, especially because this is the longest list of books that I've ever included in a single video. My videos already tend to run on the longer side whenever I'm talking about like 5 or 10 books. So 15, I'm gonna try to keep it brief. I'm gonna try to keep it sort of a mixture, because some viewers have said that they appreciate the sort of longer discussions, and some viewers have said that a little editing might be required. I'm taking both into account, so I'm gonna be brief but descriptive. I'm gonna get into it, but I'm going to be as laconic as I possibly can be. I am not known to be laconic, so bear with me. But yes, here we go. First off, coming in at number 15 is a book that just greatly impacted me during my adolescence when I first read this. I first read this when I was 15. It was 2009. I remember it vividly. I was a sophomore in high school. I found a copy discarded in a box outside my high school library that they were just going to throw away. And I thought, no, I need to scavenge this for whatever it's worth. And this book called out to me. And I'm telling you, when books call out to you for no apparent reason, go with that gut feeling, because you never know where it's going to take you. And for me, it took me to The Stranger by Albert Camus. Oh, we're matching. Love that. The Stranger, L'étranger, as it's known in French. It's a novel that I think does not need an introduction. It's celebrated as one of the greatest novels ever written, one of the most important European works of philosophical fiction. And as we know, Albert Camus is the granddaddy of existential philosophy and literature, along with his homegirl, Jean-Paul Sartre. And they both sort of went at it during their heyday. But for me, Camus came triumphant with his own take on absurdism, on the elation, the embracing of the absurdity, the gentle indifference of the world, as he called it. And in the face of meaninglessness and despair, the book packs an actual positive, uplifting message, which you might think impossible, but it very much is, as he proves it here. A man who, in very few words, does not fit into life, essentially. He has a very peculiar way of thinking, of carrying himself in the world, and eventually it lands him in a great heap of trouble. But he sticks to his guns. He sticks to his philosophy that, you know, he should not be forced to partake in anything that he doesn't want to do. He doesn't have to conform to authority. He doesn't have to answer to authority, and not in a rebellious sort of way, but more of like this passive, quiet sort of rebellion that when you're a teenager, isn't that really ultimately all you have at your disposal? I know I did. So for very personal reasons, you know, I think this book carried me through a lot of my adolescence. I found myself reading it over and over. And as I talked about this before, because I actually reread it recently for a book club that I was part of with some friends. This was my pick. So definitely didn't carry the same power that it did when you're an angsty, rebellious teenager who's barely getting into existentialism, grappling with the questions of the meaning of life, smoking cigarettes. I don't know. Don't smoke if you're a teenager. No. I've been 10 years smoke free. Go me. But this was definitely the most impactful book of my adolescence, hands down. And it's at number 15 because, like I said, it doesn't really hold up that much now. If I make it to, being a senior citizen, I'm definitely going to give this another look. But that's number 15. Number 14 is another book that I've also talked about before because I also reread this recently. It is one of my all-time favorite books. Obviously, that's why it's here. And it's one of my favorites simply because it's such an enjoyable read to me. Like, I have read this like 3 times now, and I never get tired of revisiting it. This is White Noise by DeLillo. Often considered to be one of the great American novels. It was written in the 80s at the height of consumerism, of sort of this rampant sense of loss, of personal loss, of a philosophical and cultural loss, frenetic sort of exposure to media. Television figures prominently here. We basically follow the plight of an all-American family and they're wrestling with the concepts of, the family unit, identity, lifestyle, natural disasters, man-made disasters, drug addiction, divorce, watching television. It's very sort of like a proto Simpsons diatribe on the American dream, and a lot of scathing remarks on California. If you know me, I'm from California, and I actually have a love-hate relationship with this place, more love than hate sometimes. But it all comes out here. Don DeLillo is scathing. He is unforgiving. He looks American lifestyles in the eye, and he says that's just complete garbage. but there is still a sense of play in it. I mean, of course, Don DeLillo is also a participant in our society, but he sees no need to keep up any sort of pretense or tastefulness when it comes to his descriptions of, extramarital affairs, of the aimlessness of youth, of the inadequacy for academia and philosophy to properly describe our living situations, and it's also has a very strong sort of environmental message as well, if you can believe that. Next up is a book that I read when I was in college, and I cannot think of a better sort of era of my life to have read this. If you are in college and you are currently studying humanities, you're living on campus, well, probably not living on campus right now, obviously, but if you're studying the humanities, if you're in college currently as an undergrad or as a grad student, this is definitely something that you should at least consider reading. This is Stoner by John Williams. No, before you ask, it's not about drugs. Let's just get that out of the way. This is a novel about a man who comes from a rural background. Hello, nice to meet you. and he goes off to study in college, and he is pressured by his family to study some kind of engineering or some kind of practical science or anything of that sort that's basically going to make him money. He ultimately takes a class on literature, and he falls madly in love with the field of literary studies, so much so that he changes the path of his life completely to wanting to study to be a university professor. The kind of resonance that this had with me on a personal level was just incredible. There were passages at times, I mean, this is written by a man from, rural parts of America that are, whiter. But I also come from a rural place in California. I also come from a family that sort of always laid that pressure on me to, you have to study engineering or something that's going to make you money. And then I majored in English. And this is the kind of explanation of that kind of facet of life that I feel not a lot of people write about, especially not as vulnerably and thoroughly as John Williams does in this novel. It's ultimately such a powerful novel about love, about passion, about those kinds of emotional and personal movements that we don't often allow to guide our lives. But here, he has a character that ultimately gives into his passion more unabashedly than I've ever seen any other character in fiction do. It's a book about academia. It's a book about familial issues. Like I've said, it was so powerful, emotionally raw. It just struck a very personal chord with me, and I just absolutely loved when I read it. I felt sort of fulfilled. I felt sort of vindicated in my own ways of life, if that makes any sense. It was so powerful. It's rare that I get to read something and say, that was powerful, that was moving, but this was definitely one of those books. Next up, at number 12 on this list, is City of Night by John Rechy. John Rechy is a Chicano writer, queer Chicano writer, who actually writes of his own experiences living both in the East and West Coast, And primarily during the 60s, which is around the time that he wrote this. He actually wrote this, I believe, in very close temporal proximity to the Stonewall riots, which of course eventually ignited the LGBTQ liberation movements and unrest. City of Night is a book that's sort of fragmented and sort of loosely, indeterminately follows the lives of the people who work at night, who work in obscurity, who work at the margins of society. Sex workers, cross-dressers, trans people, queer people. It's just such an honest statement of the conditions of these lives that have otherwise never really been given a voice, especially during the 60s. I mean, writing something like this during that decade was probably unthinkable to most authors. What really surprised me, again, it's that kind of vulnerability and the kind of honesty with which John Rechy writes. And if you haven't noticed by now, honesty is something that I highly, highly, highly value in a lot of books. I don't like sort of pretense or taking this sort of philosophical ivory tower position when you get down and dirty with the details, which of course John Rechy does. And it was such an important book for me at a time when I was also grappling with questions about my own identity, about my place in this world, the sort of fears and the sort of attacks that one faces. Really powerful stuff, really emotionally driven. And I just found it such a joy to find a book like this to address sort of the forefathers of a movement that eventually led to the liberation of people to freely express and partake in their sexuality. And I think John Rechy, especially being a Chicano writer, resonated with me at a personal level as well. This is another book that sort of shits on California, so that's always an A+ from me. Next up at number 11, I told myself, you have to pick a Gothic novel because I owe a lot to Gothic literature. I'm a big fan, and I thought I have to pick one for this top list. And I thought, the logical move at first, I was like, Frankenstein, right? Like that's the Gothic novel if you're gonna talk about the Gothic. It's science fiction, it's horror, it's supernatural, it's got the whole shebang. But the more I thought about it, the more this title instead kept popping into my mind. And ultimately, I thought if I have to pick between Frankenstein and Wuthering Heights by Emily Bronte, I'm gonna go with Wuthering Heights. It's the mean-spiritedness of it all for me. It's the raw emotional power. It's the absolute mercilessness. It's the absolute destruction of love and tenderness as we progress to what is ultimately just such a bitter novel. The relationship between Heathcliff and Catherine Crenshaw is, of course, just the most petty, the most harrowing sort of dramatic theatrics that I have ever experienced in literature. And Emily Bronte was writing from such an unhinged point of view that I was just completely blown away by how horrific this novel actually was. You think Wuthering Heights, you think romance, you think, unrequited love, you think the impossibility of love. But no, this book is dark as shit. It's just so unbelievably twisted and and evil. There's something about the incapability of these two main characters to sort of relate, to sort of connect, and just laying destruction, complete apocalypse on their family name in the wake of their unrequited passions. It's just so unbelievably amazing. Emily Bronte was truly such a unique visionary of that sort of grueling, derelict human soul that not a lot of other authors I can say have written about as effectively as she has here. And I love it for reasons that you might not initially think to associate with Wuthering Heights. But believe me, if you have never read it, if you've only heard about the title, if you've only heard of it as like that boring old book that they make you read in high school. Give it a read, and I assure you, you are going to be astonished. You're going to be repulsed. You are going to just be like, what the hell is this? Next up is another book that I've also already talked about in another one of my videos. But hey, guess what? I'm going to talk about it again. um, Absolutely one of my favorites, like I said in that video, and I'm saying it again, The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. Shirley Jackson is just so American in her horror and despair. What a lot of people like to associate this title with is the supernatural, right? It's a ghost story. It's the haunting of Hill House, after all. What a lot of people don't take away from it, or sort of tend to ignore when they go into it blindly, is that more so than supernatural phenomena, more so than, straight up horrific exploration of a haunted house, this is a novel about human isolation. It's a portrait of loneliness that is very rare in its vulnerability and its sort of hopelessness. Of course, the main character, Eleanor Vance, I think it's one of the most lonely, pathetic characters that I have ever read about. And I'm not saying that in a derogatory or judgmental way. The reason I'm saying that she's so pathetic is because it's so relatable to to that kind of human vulnerability, loneliness, lack of, being unable to fit in, being ostracized, being unsure of what your space in the world is, if there ever will be a sort of purpose for your life. That's what The Haunting of Hill House is about. That's what Shirley Jackson was writing about, and that's why I love this book. If you want to hear more of my thoughts on it, go check out that video I did on queer horror. But this is absolutely one of my favorite novels. Eleanor Vance is one of my favorite fictitious characters of all time, and this is horrific, unlike unlike anything else. But you have to read it to truly understand what I mean when I say horrific, because it's not the kind of horrific that you are imagining. Coming in at number 9 is the Autobiography of Assata Shakur. This is the most essential portrait of American life that has ever been written, hands down, for me. It's not number 1 because of personal reasons, but if I had to pick a sort of definitive American novel, it would either be this or it would be another one that I'm going to talk about later on. Assata Shakur, because if you're unfamiliar with her story, she was convicted of manslaughter, of murder, actually, because of her debatably direct or indirect involvement in a shooting in New Jersey, Turnpike shooting that occurred, I believe, in 1973, in which a police officer was murdered by a group that was tied to the Black Liberation Army. Of course, that group including Assata Shakur, who was a primary leader and organizing of the Black Liberation Army. The Black Liberation Army, in case you're unaware, was a sort of sub-facet of the Black Panther movement, a sort of more radical group that was largely categorized by the United States as a terrorist group, in what they perceived to be a continuous action towards trying to overthrow the U.S. government or constantly antagonize authority, etc. The actual factual basis behind those claims is highly disputed, primarily by activists associated with Assata Shakur. But basically, her story is that she was involved in this shooting that ended up with a dead police officer. She was convicted of murder. She was sentenced to life in prison. Members of the Black Liberation Movement helped her escape her prison, and she is currently, ever since the 1980s, I believe, she has been living in political asylum in Cuba, and she is not allowed to return to the United States, or else she will be incarcerated. And as recently as 2016, ex-President Donald Trump actually put out a call to have her extradited from Cuba, and in order to place her in custody once more. So this is an ongoing battle that is still very present even today. But Assata Shakur does not write about that experience. Assata Shakur writes about her childhood growing up in North Carolina as a black child with her grandparents, and just the hardships, the unseen sort of underbelly of racial violence in the United States is here depicted more viscerally than I have ever seen it depicted anywhere else. Assata writes about the constant terrorist acts that her and her family had to survive, the constant discrimination, the extreme police violence that she faced growing up as a woman, including sexual assault, including constant harassment and belittling and humiliation. It's just so unbelievably important to me that people read more about her story, people read more about the stories of people like this, that people be aware that, simple movements that started as just seeking to uplift and empower people of color were actually, in a very real legal way, categorized as terrorist groups by a lot of federal U.S. forces, especially the FBI. The FBI conducted an entire investigation, which was based on harassing and keeping tabs on this woman and her associates. It's just so powerful, so important, so such a salient voice in understanding the way our society works, the way our society has worked throughout the decades. When I read this, I felt, radicalized. I felt mobilized. I felt like, there really needs to be something done in order to educate, in order to be aware of the historical interactions that are still sort of haunting and moving the mechanisms of today. Assata is just so important. Her book is so unbelievably powerful. And when I read it, I thought this is one of the most powerful reads that I have ever allowed myself to experience. And for that, I have to include it in a list like this. Up next, I am going to finally talk about a book that I have mentioned on various occasions before on this channel. I have talked about another book by this same author in which I brought this up in conversation. This is Waiting for the Barbarians by J.M. Coetzee. This book takes place in an unnamed country that is in obvious political and social turmoil and upheaval. And it features the pathetic and irreverent journey of the magistrate who works at this town that's experiencing all this social tension. He is this sort of carefree servant of the empire who is constantly seeing out that law and order are carried out, especially against the native barbarians who are constantly, or supposedly constantly, attempting to siege and overthrow this control over this town, which is held under the control of the empire. Eventually, he sees himself implicated with a barbarian woman with whom he ignites a sexual relationship, and that sort of just overturns his entire life, from going from like this quiet, complacent servant of the empire to being implicated in what are supposed crimes against the state. Supposedly he is framed, or he is judged as conspiring with the barbarians because of his relationship with this woman. And what compels me to call this one of my favorite books is simply its treatment of the concept of torture. This is a book that I read and just could not believe what I was reading. And it's not so much the graphic detail of it. Like I've talked about pretty much everything that can be said about graphic depictions of violence in literature, but it's not so much that. It's just that that idea that Coetzee understands that we can all be complicit in violence in one way or another, whether we like to accept that or not, either by actively enacting violence on others or sitting by complacently and letting it happen. It also brings into question, the moral, sort of the philosophical fiber of the concept of torture, of the duality of the actions of mankind, where one can be, a kind and caring father in, certain periods of the day, and then on the others there'll be a merciless torturer seeking answers. The concept of truth, the veracity of details, the fabrication of reality, when reality itself, when history itself is controlled by the state, it's controlled by a tyrannic government. There's just so much to explore about social unrest, and rightfully so. Of course, Coetzee is writing from having, grown up in apartheid in South Africa. Just so powerful, raises such important topics and questions that should always be, discussed, especially, during our times, which, let's face it, they have never really been the most peaceful, stable of times. I think this is essential reading for anybody looking to explore and understand the concepts of violence, of torture, of social unrest. And this is a haunting book for sure, and one that I will probably never be able to forget. And up next, I am going to be talking about, my number 7 pick for this list is Kindred by Octavia Butler. This is categorized in many different genres or literary narrative styles. It's been called a slave novel. It's been called a science fiction novel. It's been called a supernatural drama, etc., etc. Basically, the main components of the story are time travel, slavery, identity politics, and racial relationships in America. Octavia Butler is one of my favorite authors. She was an amazing, unique voice in literature, a much needed Black female voice in the field of science fiction. And I think, may she rest in peace, Kindred was definitely her magnum opus. And I see it sort of gain traction the more the years go by. And I think by now it's definitely been cemented as just this absolute classic novel. Classic American novel. I see it being read more and more in high schools, and I think that's fantastic because it rightfully should be. Basically, it follows the life of a modern Black woman, contemporary to the time it was written, named Dana, who, along with her white partner, finds that they have been constantly jumping back and forth in time, traveling back to slave era America, in which her ancestors are both masters and slaves, and then jumping back to present time and trying to sort of deal with and cope with the different existences that they are tugging back and forth in. And it raises, of course, a lot of interesting and disturbing and grueling questions about, positions of power, about racialized positions of power. One of the main conflicts that Dana finds is that, when they travel back in time, by default, her husband, who she considers equal in the modern world, equal to her, is inherently placed at a higher echelon of humanity because he is white. And, how do you cope with these varying sentiments of the history that haunts you versus the reality that you are living in? That question, if you're a person of color, is so unbelievably prescient and important. And it's something that Octavia Butler explores thoroughly in this novel. But science fiction being one of my favorite literary genres, being mixed with this social reality of a racial-based discourse makes this an absolutely just amazing, harrowing, titillating, and unforgettable and completely unique read. I recommend this to anybody. Really, it's so enjoyable. Octavia Butler, she's not only writing about important social topics, she also writes with such a powerful, unique, concise and surefire voice that I just absolutely love everything that she ever wrote. And Kindred, like I said, is her masterpiece. And this is also, as I was saying, one that I would consider one of the greatest American novels ever written, along with the autobiography of Assata Shakur. This, to me, is the American novel to read if you're going to pick one. Next up, oh man, I see myself sort of going through these emotional journeys every time I pick one of these books up. Next up, I'm going to talk about Brothers and Keepers by John Edgar Wideman. John Edgar Wideman is a person of academia. He is a novelist, very celebrated. And in here, in this memoir, he is writing about his experience, his dissonance, his conflicts, and ultimately his unending love for his brother, who is a criminal fugitive who is eventually incarcerated. This is a book to read. If ever there was a book written about the American prison system, one, and also about the unfailing sort of familial bonds that drive us. And it's just so personal to me because I have had several members of my family, close members of my family, siblings who have been involved in legal troubles and incarcerated, and I am sort of the more educated person in my family, like first generation college student, etc. Sort of to come from that perspective that's very similar to John Edgar Wideman, who is also a person of academia, raised in academia, who is conversely trying to deal with the emotional bond and at the same time social dissonance that he has with his sibling, who is a wanted criminal. That to me just spoke volumes. It said everything that I had ever thought but wasn't able to articulate. It got me through so much, sort of personal turmoil, and at the end really uplifted me in a major way. For those very deeply personal reasons, I choose this to be in my list. But besides all that, this is a greatly crafted memoir. It's powerful, it's disturbing, it's emotionally grueling, but just such an amazing book. One of the books that I can certainly say I am so grateful to have discovered and read, because it really meant a lot to me and it really helped me solve a lot of emotional baggage that I constantly deal with in everyday life. So John Edgar Wideman, definitely such a uplifting but visceral view into his personal life that I'm sure resonates with many of us. And then finally, we're going to get into our top 5, my top 5 favorite novels of all time. This is where shit got real. This is where, like, okay, I need my game face on. I really need to pick my absolute favorite, most favorite books of all time. And I think I did a really good job, so check it out. At number 5, Stephen King. Come on, I have to pick Stephen King. Stephen King is one of the first authors that I was ever obsessed with. I first discovered him through his novel The Shining when I was 12 years old. It is one of the first novels that I ever read. I kind of came into the reading game later than a lot of book lovers. I feel like most book lovers read since they first learned how to read. But I didn't actually start reading novels until I was 12 or 13. But Stephen King certainly helped guide me through that. And in trying to pick my favorite book of his was no easy feat. I was going to go with The Shining because I've talked about it before and because, it is an amazing book and it's the first book of his that I ever read. But actually, I'm going to pick a book that I feel is sort of set apart from most of his work, and also one that he didn't even write under his name. But my favorite book of his and my number 5 pick is The Long Walk. The Long Walk is more of like this dystopian thriller rather than straight up horror, but of course it is very horrific. It's basically the story of this annual American tradition where a bunch of young male teenagers are chosen to participate in the Long Walk, an event in which they have to walk all along the New England coast, and they have to keep a speed of 4 kilometers per hour. And if they slow down, they are given a warning. If they get 3 warnings, they are shot to death. And the last kid that is left standing is awarded with whatever he wishes for, is what they say. Of course, to get it all out of the way, harrowing, disturbing, gruesome, emotionally hurtful, just at the edge of your seat terror, all the typical signs of a good Stephen King novel. But more so than that, I feel like this was just such a culturally resonant book that actually didn't really pick up that much steam until things like The Hunger Games came and whatever the other fucking, what was it, Divergence and John I don't even fucking know. But Stephen King did it first, y'all. This definitely does read a lot like young adult fiction, which is something to say because I don't really read young adult fiction, but I think this is what it sounds like. um, but it's just such a memorable book for me. I read this when I was very young. As you can see, this is my original copy that I had back then. It's seen better days, but still hanging in there. I just absolutely love this book for sentimental reasons only. It's at number 5 because I just remember the process of reading this, of being at the edge of my seat, of just unfolding this harrowing narrative of children being shot to death one by one. 12-year-old me was not ready, to say the least. So just for that reason, I have to include Stephen King in a list of my favorite books. I just have to. And this is my favorite of his by far. My pick for number 4 is not a novel, it's not a memoir, it's more of a book-length critical essay. It is by James Baldwin. I have to include James Baldwin just like I have to include Stephen King. And I was sort of scrambling my head, sort of going, which book of his am I going to pick? Notes of a Native Son, The Fire Next Time, Giovanni's Room. What is it? And you know what? If I'm being completely honest with myself and with you all, my favorite book by James Baldwin is actually his book-length essay, The Devil Finds Work. The Devil Finds Work is James Baldwin at the movies, offering us, his own sort of social commentary and of assessment of like iconic films. Of course, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, even The Exorcist, which I actually quoted that passage where he reviews The Exorcist in my queer horror video. This is just such a unique piece of, media criticism. And media criticism is something that I was highly involved with in college, like when I was writing my senior thesis and stuff like that. And James Baldwin definitely chains together those two sort of prescient issues of evaluating and critiquing media while keeping this sort of class, racial, and gender consciousness in mind. Melding the two, you get The Devil Finds Work, which is just such a unique, powerful little book that explores the sort of hidden racial and gender expressions behind seemingly commercialized, perhaps highly unrelated films. James Baldwin, what he's doing here is he's evaluating American culture through movies, which is something that most film critics do now. But the way that he does it is so radical, so scathing, so unapologetic. I absolutely love his evaluations of American life as seen through the screen. It's just something you have to read to believe. And like I said, if I have to pick a James Baldwin book to read for the coming years, it would be this one. He is amazing. I have read, I think, almost everything that he has ever written. He is one of my absolute favorite authors, and this is one of my absolute favorite books. Top 3, here we go. These were actually the easiest ones to pick for me, because these are the ones that I was like, okay, immediately drawn to these titles. The ones that have really sort of shifted my worldview and viewpoint, sort of Madden whiplash left and right. So coming in at number 3, I would say my number 3 most favorite book of all time is Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf. Now this may seem kind of random to some of you, but I have to tell you, I read this and I could not believe the narrative prowess that Miss Woolf was unfolding before my very eyes. This is a book that a lot of people hate, a lot of people find confusing, unreadable. I made an entire video about unreadable books where I mentioned Virginia Woolf, rightfully so, I would say. I think this is one of her most intelligible books, but still not for the faint of heart. in terms of readability, where Clarissa Dalloway is throwing a party in which old friends are coming to visit, reigniting sort of long buried or ignored memories, hidden lesbian passions, and all of it is interconnecting with the other goings on of the social of the society around her. Of particular note and memorability for me in this novel was the story of a World War One veteran, or the Great War as it was known back then, and his struggles with PTSD, which was highly undeveloped as a mental illness back then, and his constant and futile search for happiness, for peace, along with his wife. Just such intimate yet intricate moments like that Virginia Woolf was a master at immortalizing. I think mostly what she wrote about was the passage of time, the aging of the mind, and sort of that never-ending struggle to try to immortalize it, to try to solidify it, to try to make it memorable, to try to make it exist far beyond the capabilities of what temporality allows. It's just such a despairing tale, as all of her books tend to be. And like I said, she was highly concerned with time. She was highly concerned with being in the moment, with ingesting the setting, the people around you, the memories that you build with them. It was just a powerful, unsettling little book that I read this in one day as well, and I thought Virginia Woolf, from here on, I will name her one of my absolute most favorite authors of art of all time. And Mrs. Dalloway remains one of the best books that I have ever read. Like I said, it might not be for everybody, but this is just so beautiful. This is just so thorough. This is so complex and yet so ultimately fulfilling, an uplifting message for humanity, for our existence, for what we are in this world for. For the love that we give and receive, and the faltering, the failure of communication at times. It's everything sort of dancing, and it's just so overwhelming, so destructful, so scary, all these things. But Virginia Woolf pens it with such poise. She's just so masterful at handling time, at handling the world. And truly, this is one of the greatest books that I have ever read. Coming in at number 2 is another book-length essay. This one is by the French philosopher and social critic Frantz Fanon. And this book is Black Skin, White Masks. Perhaps the most important work of post-colonial philosophy. Black Skin, White Masks details Fanon's racial social existence within the country of French Algeria, and he utilizes things like psychoanalysis. He utilizes things like social relations, racial disparities, racial confrontations, racial violence, all to ultimately paint a wholesome picture of what existence was like, and in many cases still is like, for Black people worldwide. This modern work, the modern voice that guides his work, which was so influential for what ultimately became the civil rights movement in the United States. Frantz Fanon being such a radical, empowering voice of Black identity. To me, it was just so eye-opening and so powerful. Frantz Fanon, was writing about existential questions that the likes of which Camus was also struggling with. But Frantz Fanon understands that one of the most defining features of life is the race and privilege with which one is born, the sort of cultural upheaval that we suffer from, depending on what you look like, or what kind of dynamics you are forced to play out in this sort of theatric display of racial relations, or what have you. Fanon is extending, it's stretching, it's dissecting and tearing apart that concept of double consciousness that, of course, Du Bois immortalized in his work, The Souls of Black Folk, but is here given that modern, like I said, psychoanalytical flavor to truly get at the heart of the human psyche in relation to race. It's just such a powerful dissection of that discourse of, how we exist in the skin we're in and what that does to define us. How we play with race, how we play with identity, all of it. It's just so unbelievably, at times graphic, at times disturbing, at times visceral, but always so rewarding and rich in knowledge and insight. When I read this book, I simply could not believe what I was reading. So impactful, so, moving towards understanding my own position in this world, my own identity, my own gripes with race, with identity, with gender identity, with racial identity, with the place that you take in the social ladder, what that means to you, and how these other psychological movements come into play. And this all seems so self-evident now because there's been so much critical race theory written since Fanon put out this book. But a lot of it are more developed concepts that Fanon essentially sort of prototyped in this book. This is one of the most important books that I have ever read. And so finally, number one, my number one most absolute favorite book of all time. What is it going to be? Well, you already know if you're looking at the timestamps, you cheater. But it's Pedro Paramo by Juan Rulfo. This is a book. Juan Rulfo is a Mexican author. This is a book about Mexico, essentially, but it's a Mexico that's dramatized, that's sort of boiled down to its essentials in a apocalyptic and harrowing tale of the relationship between father and son. This is a novel about a man who is looking for his father, his long lost father, and he is looking for him at the request of his dying mother, whose dying wish was that he find him and that he demand of him what's rightfully theirs for having, given her a son and then abandoned her. What unfolds from there is the history of the father, Pedro Paramo, who fathered many children, who built essentially a microcosm of a patriarchy in which he was the head. And, ultimately it grapples with, unrequited love of the perversity, the perverting nature of love, the social destruction and humiliation that ultimately unfolds in an entire Mexican apocalypse. And that's just beginning to describe my reasons for choosing this book as number one. I think this book is one of the few that I've actually felt has dealt with such personal issues that are so unique to a Mexican identity. Of course, this novel is highly celebrated in Mexico as being one of the best, if not the best, works of Mexican literature ever written. I don't need to sing its praises on that regard, but for me personally, reading about this was not just uplifting in terms of like this national identity and resonance with cultural aspects of my life, but also because it's a work about masculinity, about Mexican masculinity, unlike anything else I've ever really read. I mean, it's a highly scathing, critical, vantage point on, the not just, of course, the obviously toxic and misogynistic aspects of masculinity, but also the vulnerability, the fragility of it that haunts, Mexican identity, that has haunted Mexican identity for decades, is what Rulfo, I feel, is ultimately writing about. This book is incredible. I almost find it a little bit difficult to put into words just how amazing it is. When I read it again, and then I read it again. I am not kidding, back to back, like 3 times. It was just amazing, such a powerful little book. It's about, this sort of violent encounters between families, between societies, the clashing sort of ideals of masculinity and duty and power play. And it's just so amazing, so disquieting. I cannot say I've ever been as impacted by a book as I have been by this. And like I said, it is kind of hard to articulate just why it's so resonated with me on such a personal level, because maybe I'm not the best at expressing personal thoughts. But I have to say, it is an amazing piece of fiction. One of the leading inspirations for what ultimately became the magic realism movement in Latin America. People like Carlos Fuentes and Gabriel Garcia Marquez have never tired of singing at its praises. Fantastic, fantastic little book. I would never get tired of reading this. It means the world to me. It really means the world to me. I don't know. You probably think I'm joking. I'm not. And I'm not exaggerating either. This is the greatest piece of fiction that I have ever read. And I absolutely adore it. And I do find it as being sort of part of my own identity, or the steps that I have taken towards building my own identity. Wonderful. Well, there you have it. My voice is breaking. That took a little longer than I thought. It's going to be a lot of fun to edit this. I know maybe some of my picks may be a little shocking to you, because you might be more used to me talking about other kinds of literature, like harrowing, disturbing, gruesome. So yeah, I fully acknowledge this is a little different from everything else. But I think you kind of get to see more of a complete picture of who I am as a reader, as a lover of literature. Horror and disturbing and transgressive fiction are always nice, and I never get tired of talking about that either. But as you can see, literature in general fascinates me, and I absolutely love literature of all kinds. And I think that is just about enough of me talking about myself. Thank you for watching. If you have watched this far, I hope you enjoyed the video. Give it a like, because I just learned that if the more likes the video gets, the more it's recommended to other people. So that would be kind of nice. So give it a like if you enjoyed it. Subscribe if you haven't. And I will see you in my next video. Yes, the bookshelf tour is coming. I promise. It's coming. All right. Thank you for watching.